Hi, Ian. This is your friend Zhao. Today is the 10th of December 2022. I'm here at Princeton to bring you a surprise, so follow me. Hi, Ace. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing great. How are you?
Okay, I'm good too. Thank you. Can I ask you some questions about Mother Teresa? Because I know you've been reading about her.
Yeah, I'd love to.
First question. One of the things that Mother Teresa lived out and said to her sisters was, forget yourself. So does it mean a complete focus on other people?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I think one of the virtues that Mother Teresa exemplified most clearly in her life was the virtue of humility. And I think something that's really important to remember about humility is, and this is a quote that I heard long ago, is that humility is not about thinking less of yourself, like self-deprecating, but it's about thinking of yourself less. So thinking more about others and like how you can serve them and love them. And so I think this really reminds me of what Jesus says in the Gospels, because there's a scene in the Gospels where Jesus is asked what are the greatest commandments. And he basically says that the two greatest commandments are to love God and to love our neighbor. And I think Mother Teresa really showed that in how she loved God and also loved the poor that she was working with. There's a lot of really great stories from her life, but one of my favorite stories of Mother Teresa is that there was once a bull that was rampaging through their village, and something that she did is to protect her fellow sisters and also the kids that she was working with in the village. She chased the bull out, and you can think this Mother Teresa, so she's on the older side and she's not like very physically strong, but the fact that this old nun is chasing away a bull, that is like such a powerful example of the radical love, I think, that her whole mission kind of is pointing to, and how much she really brings her love for God into her radical love for the people that she's serving. And I think especially with the phrase forgetting yourself, it's really about a two-sided coin, because on one hand you're forgetting yourself so that you can remember God and your neighbor. And also with forgetting yourself, like I mentioned, it's not supposed to be like, oh, let me just focus everything on everyone and then I won't take care of myself, like I won't eat, I won't like shower or something like that. The whole idea is the love that Mother Teresa has is, it's supposed to be a gift of self, and she's kind of following Jesus' example because he died for the people that he loved, like he gave everything. And that's sort of what she's calling her sisters to follow the example of, to not be afraid to love when you have to do hard things. Because sometimes when you love others, you might be like hesitant to, because sometimes you might have to like give up some time or effort to love people and to serve them. But for her, and like with everything she did throughout her life, with the example with the bull, she was unafraid to love, just like Jesus was. And the whole idea is, when one forgets oneself, it's not in the sense that you're burning yourself out like in an unhealthy way, but at least for her, she was always mindful to keep her relationship with God strong, because she was receiving from God so that she could give everything she had to the people that she loved. Because without first receiving from God, she can't give something that she doesn't have. And so she loved from being loved first.
Well, it's very interesting that you mentioned Mother Teresa's relationship with God and with other people. So actually, the second question I have for you is, in Mother Teresa's life for about 50 years, she just felt an intense darkness, a total absence of God, but at the same time, she was so joyful and never failed to love the poor. Why is that?
Yeah, so I think the spiritual darkness of Mother Teresa is one of the really unique parts of her sainthood. But in a way, it's also something that a lot of us Christians are we'll have to experience sometime in our own life, because in the journey of faith, there's always going to be ups and downs, spiritual dryness and spiritual consolations. And so I think with Mother Teresa, the darkness that she felt can sometimes be a little shocking to read in her diaries, because right, like, she's this saint, and we think of her as a very amazing role model for her faith. And you go into the diary, and then she says how she feels like she had been abandoned by God, and that she can't feel his presence. And then this might make you wonder, like, oh, like, how am I supposed to follow her model of faith? But I think the really beautiful thing about reading her diaries and really seeing what she had to say and how she brought this to prayer, the beautiful thing is that the story doesn't just end there. So for context, she started her missionary of charities when she was a nun on a retreat with the rest of her sisters in Calcutta. And on the train ride to Calcutta, she felt this call in prayer from Jesus, asking her to be his light for these people, the poor and the suffering. And for her, she, not wanting to refuse Jesus anything, accepted this, and she wanted to dedicate her life to these people. And shortly after starting the Missionaries of Charity, she started feeling this intense darkness. So like the diary said, feeling abandoned by God, not being able to find his presence. And for the longest time, she would write how it almost felt like everything was dead and she couldn't find God. And she would also bring this to her spiritual director. So she talked to her priest about maybe what's happening in her spiritual life. And at first she thought that this dryness was a test from God, that he was trying to purify her imperfections, or something of that nature. And over time, and keeping this in prayer constantly, she came to the realization that her own suffering and her own dryness was a gift from Jesus to be able to be united with the suffering and pain that he experienced while on earth. And so there's a really great quote that I have in this book that's been sitting right next to me, by Mother Teresa. And it really summarizes well essentially her motivation for her entire mission. And that can be summarized in 2 words, which is I thirst. And these 2 words, I thirst, come from one of Jesus' last words when he was on the cross. Because Jesus on the cross said, I thirst, and the soldiers gave him bitter wine to drink. Though for Mother Teresa, this phrase, I thirst, was not for wine or like water, but for these people, these souls that he loves so much. Like, he thirsts to be with them. And so for her, she has this really beautiful quote about this darkness and what she realized, how this darkness is actually a gift. For the first time in 11 years, I have come to love the darkness, for I believe now that it is a very, very small part of Jesus' darkness and pain on earth. And now I know that when you feel miserable inside, look at the cross and you will know what is happening. Suffering, pain, sorrow, humiliation, feelings of loneliness are nothing but the kiss of Jesus, a sign that you have come so close that he can kiss you. So I think that's kind of one of my favorite quotes from her, because for her, suffering was not a curse, but an opportunity to enter into and to be really united with Jesus in the darkness that he experienced. Because like the poor, Jesus entered into the world into a poor family that didn't have anything. They had to flee from the king who was persecuting them. And then throughout their life, or throughout Jesus' life, he didn't have a place to call his own home. He didn't have a permanent place to sleep or rest his head. And eventually, at the end of his life, he was crucified on a cross. And so his life, too, was also marked by darkness and by pain. And for Mother Teresa, his phrase, I thirst, was a call to her to respond to his thirst. And something that's really powerful again, in her diaries, Mother Teresa, even after realizing this, it wasn't totally easy for her. She still struggled, and it was definitely a challenge, but she persisted in prayer and persisted in serving the poor and loving God. And she wrote in one of her letters that, right, she writes, God, I can't see you, I can't feel you, but I believe that you are there, because I know your disguises. And then she goes on to talk about who God is for her, who Jesus is, where he is. And she writes that Jesus is the poor man on the street, asking for help. Jesus is the drunk man to befriend. Jesus is the woman on the street needing to be taken out of a dangerous situation. And for her, she really brought the two greatest commandments, loving God and loving neighbor, into a really beautiful union with each other. Because part of her spirituality is she had a really great love for the Eucharist at Mass. And so for Catholics, the Eucharist is, we believe, to be Jesus's true presence. And so every Sunday we have the great gift of being able to receive him at communion. And so for her, and she has a great quote about this, that if you do not see God in the poor, how can you ever see him on the altar at Mass? And for her, to love God and to love neighbor were inseparable. And to see God in her neighbors was really important to her. And there's kind of something poetic about this, because Mother Teresa felt this dryness in her interior spiritual life, and she felt abandoned by God, couldn't find his presence. But she found it in the poor, because if God is in the poor and the poor are surrounding her, she is surrounded by God wherever she goes. And that's the beautiful thing about Mother Teresa's mission, is that she loved the poor with everything she had, because God has first loved her with everything he had, despite the pain, despite the suffering that he went through. And so her feeling of thirst for God was united with God's thirst for the people that he loves. And also she was united with the people that she was serving, because she saw these people, they were hungry, they were thirsty, they were sick. Even though they had material needs, she also recognized that they had a deeper spiritual need, that aside from the need for food, water, shelter, there's also the need for love. And she saw that these people too, the sick and the poor, are also thirsting for love, just as she is. And so for her, this thirst became a gift, because then she could really embrace these people who she felt she could embrace, because they too have they thirst for love, just as she had. And that's kind of that's above all the probably most impressive thing about her entire mission. And it just shows that for Mother Teresa, faith and loving God were not emotions for her. It wasn't a matter of like, okay, do I feel God's presence? Do I feel happy? For her, it was a matter of the will. It was a choice. So she chose to love God, even when she didn't feel him, even when she didn't perceive him. She chose to love, to serve, and to persevere in all that she was doing, because she knew that God was present in the people around her. And yeah, that's one of the amazing things about Mother Teresa.
Wow, that's a lot to think about. Thank you so much for sharing, Ace. So now you can go back to enjoying your reading.
Thank you. I'm so happy to answer these questions, because Mother Teresa is one of my favorite saints.
Bye bye.
นักแสดงรัก
Maligayang Pasko.
Idong Riho